To say there is a bit of controversy around the Rings of Power is a bit of an understatement. It's a highly anticipated show, but not necessarily for the right reasons so far, especially amongst the fans of Tolkien's work. One of the main controversies at the moment is the depiction of Galadriel, who has been a central part of Amazon's marketing strategy, or at least something that slightly resembles a marketing strategy. For many people, their only exposure to Galadriel is as the Lady of Lothlorien, so seeing her wearing armour and carrying a giant sword and climbing ice walls is a little bit of a change. On this channel, we examine the facts. There is no emotion, there is no bias, so in this video, let's deep dive this controversy. Is warrior Galadriel canon in any way, or is it completely fanfiction? Before I begin, I want to say that Galadriel is a mess, and by that, I mean her canon is a mess. That goes for Celeborn as well. It's often so contradictory in places that it's hard to make sense of. A major part of this is due to the fact that Galadriel was a relatively late addition to Tolkien's Legendarium. Unlike many other characters who appeared in the First Age, Galadriel's first inclusion in Tolkien's writings were actually in The Lord of the Rings. So the version of Galadriel that appears in those books is actually the earliest version of the character, and not necessarily what Tolkien had in mind by the end. He then worked his way backwards, inserting Galadriel into tales from the First and Second Age. Unfortunately, Tolkien never quite finished this, and even in the final months of his life, he was still rewriting Galadriel's history. As a result, there's a lot of open-ended questions about Galadriel as to what she actually did during the First and Second Age, and what she was actually like. If you're familiar with the history of those ages, you'll notice that Galadriel has a habit of being really important and playing a major role in major events, only to suddenly disappear from the history books for a few thousand years. For example, what the hell was Galadriel doing during the War of the Last Alliance? Nobody knows. For an analogy, imagine if during the post-production of The Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson decided that a hobbit named Steve would be added into the story to accompany Frodo and Sam. Unfortunately, the post-production team runs out of time and money, and as a result, Steve, despite coming across as a big deal in some scenes, is inexplicably missing in other scenes. And also, in the scenes he's in, Steve's backstory repeatedly changes. In one scene, Steve sets off with Frodo and Sam from the Shire on account of being one of their best friends. But in another scene, Steve is found eating trash off the side of the road in Bree, having never met Frodo before. Galadriel is Steve. Alright, so what version of Galadriel is canon? None of them and all of them. Because she was a relatively late addition, there aren't any real wacky versions of Galadriel that don't make any sense, unlike Sauron who was once a cat. So you can sort of work with most versions and they all sort of fit into the story. Okay, back to the topic of the video. Let's address the controversy. Is warrior Galadriel canon? Because it isn't the job of people to prove a negative, let's look at the evidence for this claim. The evidence that Amazon is seemingly using for their adaptation, that Galadriel is a warrior. If you followed this controversy at all, you might have encountered the following bits of evidence. Her mother name was Nerwen, Man-Maiden, and she grew to be tall beyond the measure even of the women of the Noldor. She was strong of body, mind, and will, a match for both the Lawmasters and the athletes of the Eldar in the days of their youth. This is from the Shibboleth of Feanor, a passage from Peoples of Middle-earth. It was written sometime after 1968. It's a fairly clear description. Galadriel is tall, strong, and athletic, so much so that she could match it with the best. Her mother name also means Man-Maiden, which is... I don't really know if that's a compliment, but once again, it clearly speaks of her strength. This description is backed up by the following. She was then of Amazon disposition, and bound up her hair as a crown when taking part in athletic feats. This appears in one of Tolkien's letters, letter 348 from March 1973, a mere 6 months before his death. The use of the word Amazon further reinforces Galadriel's description as tall, strong, and athletic. Given both of these pieces of evidence emerged late in Tolkien's life, it seems that this is the version of Galadriel that he had settled upon, at least in terms of physical description. So one thing is definitely clear and pretty much inarguable. Galadriel is physically quite capable. She's definitely no damsel in distress. Alright, so we know that Galadriel is undoubtedly athletic, but does that make her a warrior? No, because they're different things, in the same way that football/soccer players are athletes, but are definitely not warriors. While her athleticism would certainly allow for her to become a warrior, this video isn't about dealing in hypotheticals. So for Galadriel to have been a warrior, she would have to participate in a battle, right? We know Galadriel participated in battles during the War of the Ring. It's very heavily implied that she played an active role during the first, second, and third assaults upon Lothlorien, and that her power was so great that Lothlorien only would have fallen had Sauron himself showed up. She also participates in the destruction of Dol Guldur, and although Celeborn is described as leading the assault, Galadriel is said to have thrown down its walls and laid bare its pits. Of course, the most accepted interpretation of these events is that Galadriel used magic to great effect during these battles, not that she waded into the action with a sword and kicked some orcish ass. And I do agree with this interpretation. The description of throwing down walls and unearthing pits almost certainly implies that some powerful magic was used, and we know by this point in time that Galadriel was a very powerful magic user. But there is evidence that very much suggests that she did take part in physical combat in at least one battle. Even after the merciless assault upon the Teleri and the rape of their ships, though she fought fiercely against Feanor in defense of her mother's kin, she did not turn back. This is from the Unfinished Tales, and it describes one version of the kinslaying at Alcalonde, as opposed to the Silmarillion version, where there is no mention of Galadriel taking part in the battle. Once again, this was written later in Tolkien's life. During one of his rewrites, where Tolkien decided that Celeborn would instead be a Teleran elf named Teleporno instead of a Sindar of Doriath, there is a similar passage. In Feanor's revolt that followed the darkening of Valinor, Galadriel had no part. Indeed, she with Celeborn fought heroically in defense of Alcalonde against the assault of the Noldor, and Celeborn's ship was saved from them. For me, the usage of fiercely and heroically seems to imply that Galadriel was in the midst of the action, not acting as a commander, and given we know how strong and athletic she is, it isn't unbelievable to think that she could fight well and hard in this scenario. One could argue that she might have used magic, but this is fairly early in Galadriel's life, and she hadn't yet spent years living with Melian of Doriath, so there's no real evidence to suggest that Galadriel was capable of using magic to fight in battles at this point. Also, it's worth remembering that magic in Lord of the Rings is far more subtle than in things like Dungeons and Dragons, so it's not like Galadriel would have been standing there hurling fireballs at people. I also want to point out that Galadriel would have been present at other battles too. She would have been in the Noldoran host when the Battle of Lamoth occurred, although she's never mentioned as participating in the battle. Notably, Christopher Tolkien wrote this in the Unfinished Tales whilst addressing one of his father's inconsistencies. It is a natural assumption that Celeborn and Galadriel were present at the ruin of Doriath. It is said in one place that Celeborn escaped the sack of Doriath, and perhaps aided the escape of Elwing to the havens of Sirion with the Silmaril, but this is nowhere stated. If we're going off this natural assumption, she would have been present at the Battle of Thousand Caves, and the second kinslaying at Doriath, and possibly at the third kinslaying at the havens of Sirion. Given that she fought against the Feanorians at Alcalonde, it definitely isn't a stretch to say that she might have fought against them in Doriath and Sirion as well. After all, it's the exact same situation as Alcalonde, just in a different location, and Galadriel and the Feanorians share the mutual hatred of each other. She managed to survive both battles, whereas many others did not, which would imply that she's either a coward and was the first to run, or that she was a good enough fighter to stay alive. It's fairly obvious which one is more likely. But of course, as Christopher says, this is nowhere stated, it's just an assumption. Another quote from the Unfinished Tales also heavily implies that Galadriel had been involved in military matters during the past. She looked upon the dwarves also with the eye of a commander, seeing in them the finest warriors to pit against the orcs. However, it's very much worth mentioning that Galadriel fighting in defense of her people or her land might not be unique amongst elven women. Indeed, in dire straits or desperate defense, the Nissi fought valiantly, and there was less difference in strength and speed between elven men and elven women that had not borne child than is seen among mortals. This is a little known quote from Morgoth's Ring, and the word Nissi references elven women. So in particularly dire circumstances, it wasn't unheard of for elven women to take up arms and act as a last line of defense. After all, if your life is endangered, why wouldn't you? However, we don't really see this occur in the story except with Galadriel, so it might not have been overly common. It also mentions that elven women who had not given birth weren't actually far off their male counterparts in terms of strength and speed, so they would also be formidable foes if trained. So, in all the battles I just mentioned, Galadriel may not have been the only woman to pick up a sword and fight, although I dare say Galadriel would be far more capable than many others. Alright, we're making progress. We now know that Galadriel is tall, strong and athletic, and that it's very likely she took part in physical combat in at least one battle, and possibly several others. However, we've also learned that elven women in general could and would take up arms in direct defense of their homes, so Galadriel wasn't exactly unique in that regard. So once again, does that make her a warrior? Well, sort of. She certainly has fought, and she probably fought quite well, but only in defensive actions. There's no mention of her marching out and fighting in the wars of the First and Second Age. If I were to summarise it rather bluntly, I would say she's a warrior, but not a soldier. In the Rings of Power, it seems fairly clear that one of Galadriel's roles will be that of an adventuring warrior. We've seen it in the teaser and the released images, something to do with hunting down Morgoth's former servants to avenge her brothers, which is a made-up plotline. And we've just established Galadriel being a warrior highly depended on the circumstances. But what about the role as an adventurer? After all, press releases have so far had her appear in Númenor, Lindon, and even Forodwaith. The answer to this part, it's actually quite accurate. She travelled quite a lot, far more than many of her contemporaries. Galadriel spent most of the First Age in Doriath, but during the Second Age, in the company of Celeborn and their followers, she was far from static. She first dwelt in Harlindon, which was a fiefdom under Gil-galad, before living for a time by the shores of Lake Evendim. In some versions of the story, it was Celeborn and Galadriel who founded Eregion, whereas in others it was Celebrimbor. Either way, they both lived there for a while. When she was based out of Eregion, Galadriel's role was almost that of an ambassador's. She played a major role in establishing good relations with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, something her husband didn't really approve of, for obvious reasons. In some versions of her story, she was also responsible for the movement of Sindar and Noldor into Lothlorien, then known as Lorinand. She ended up dwelling in Lothlorien for a while, whilst Celeborn was in Eregion, and after the War of the Elves and Sauron, one version of her tale has her travelling in the then little explored lands between the River Gwarflo and the Ethir Anduin, before eventually taking up residence in Belfalas, probably in Edelond. Even in the Third Age, Galadriel and Celeborn were constantly on the move. They returned to Lothlorien at some point, but soon left and travelled through the lands of Rhovanion, from the lands of Thranduil in the north to the lands of Gondor and the borders of Mordor in the south, even dwelling in Greenwood for a time. They would end up returning to Rivendell for a while, but after the death of King Amroth of Lothlorien, they would settle in Lothlorien for the rest of the Third Age. Needless to say, her and Celeborn were quite the travellers, and had a habit of showing up exactly where they were needed. So what's the verdict? Is Galadriel as an armour-wearing, sword-swinging adventurer accurate, or is it bullshit? Well, honestly, it's a bit of both. We know Galadriel was strong and athletic, so it definitely isn't outside the realm of her character to have her perform physical feats of strength or agility. We know that she seems to be a capable fighter, and had experienced at least one battle firsthand, and possibly several others, so it's fairly likely that she did have a sword and a set of armour. We know that she was an experienced traveller, probably among the most travelled people in Middle-earth. That being said, her participation in battles was always in either defence of her people or her land, and her only known participation in an offensive battle was in a support role, so there's no evidence she would have went off and hunted down servants of the enemy as a sword-wielding adventurer. Although she did travel, it was almost always with Celeborn and at the head of a retinue of other elves, and releases from the show seem mixed in that regard. And it's also worth mentioning that all of these descriptions about Galadriel, minus the travelling part, are from the First Age, not the Second Age, when the show was taking place. She'd grown up a little bit by the Second Age, and she demonstrates that by taking up a more senior role in events. If I had to make a judgment, I would say her current portrayal has a basis in reality, however, it does heavily exaggerate some aspects of her character. It's less the writers inventing new lore about her character, and more them heavily expanding lesser known and less important parts of her character. If I had to compare it, at the moment, it seems a little bit like the film adaptation of Denethor. It has a basis in reality, but certain character traits are greatly exaggerated. That being said, I hope the Rings of Power Galadriel is better than Peter Jackson's Denethor. The inconvenient truth is that the writers are adapting the Second Age, which provides plenty of plot points and major events that you can hit, but not a lot of the in-between. So I would expect that we will see an expansion of many existing characters alongside the cast of original characters. One such example so far is that Elrond is apparently an ambitious politician. It sounds weird, but it's kind of what the writers have to do to give him something of a character, other than just being a name that appears in the story. What matters most, though, is that the core beliefs and motivations of these characters remain unchanged, which is still possible even if we get Warrior Galadriel. This might be a controversial take, but personally, I'm not really concerned if Galadriel plays something of the role of a warrior in the show. The groundwork was there, it was just never really expanded beyond that. To be honest, when we knew nothing about the show, I was actually worried that Galadriel wouldn't work as a main character, because I thought they might just portray Galadriel as the way she is in the Third Age. By using the First Age version of her character, I think it makes it far more relatable because her flaws such as her pride, her temperament, and her own desire for power are still very much present as opposed to Third Age Galadriel. However, and this is very important, her depiction as a warrior should not come at the expense of the more important aspects of her character, her ability as an organizer and a leader, and her role as an experienced advisor for characters such as Gil-galad or Celebrimbor. She's a strategist first and foremost, a commander, someone that's brilliant at filling the gaps. Warrior Galadriel should only appear in dire circumstances or when it's something very personal to her character. She shouldn't behave like a witcher, riding around with her sword, swatting down threats whenever they appear, solving all of the problems herself. Because if that's the case, there's a very real chance she might come across as a Mary Sue to a casual audience, even if us Tolkien fans know better. It also shouldn't come at the expense of a character like Celeborn, who was not only just incredibly important to Galadriel, but also to the events of Middle-earth in its entirety. I know a lot of people are concerned that Galadriel might just be portrayed as your typical girl boss style character, but I think an accurate depiction of Celeborn should go a long way in stopping anything like that occurring. After all, they were a team, Middle-earth's greatest power couple. In the time that I was writing this script, his presence in the show seems to have been confirmed, but unfortunately we still know very little about it. Hopefully he's just not a stay-at-home dad. Ultimately, it comes down to execution, and we won't know about that until September. My one hope in this video is that we can have a rational discussion in the comment section and beyond, which has been sorely lacking in regards to Rings of Power so far. Even after I wrote this script, I was still unsure of whether I should turn it into a video, mostly due to the anger and toxicity within the community at the moment. Some of it justified, and some of it less so. After seeing what's happened to other prominent Tolkien YouTubers, it sucks that I should even have to say this, but I'm not affiliated with Amazon in any way. Jeff Bezos is an awful person, and I hope his work is unionized, which would be his worst nightmare. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I for one hope the show is good. I think it's great for the community as a whole if there are successful adaptations, from both a monetary and critical standpoint. That said, only time will tell, and whether it's good or bad, well, it will still give me plenty of talking points. Cheers, thanks again, and remember, whether you're for the show or against it, you better cheer Sexy Sauron or you're not a true Tolkien fan.